Something genuinely unprecedented in all of human history is currently taking place right now in South Korea. For the past several decades, South Korea's fertility rate, the number of children that each woman will give birth to during their lifetimes, has steadily declined year after year to the point where not only today in 2024 reached the lowest fertility rate in the world, but it's likely reached the lowest fertility rate ever measured by any society in all of human history. You see, in order to maintain a constant population within any society, the fertility rate needs to remain at an average of 2.1 children per woman in that society. If the fertility rate is higher than 2.1, then the population will be growing. And if the fertility rate is lower than 2.1, the population will be shrinking the lower the fertility rate becomes without any additional immigration from elsewhere. South Korea's fertility rate first fell beneath the 2.1 replacement level 40 years ago now, back in 1984. That was hardly historic or unprecedented though, because many other developed countries like the United States, Japan, Germany, Australia, and others had all seen their own fertility rates drop beneath the 2.1 replacement level years before the South Koreans did. But it's what happened after South Korea's fertility rate dipped beneath the replacement level that's been unprecedented, because it just kept on sinking and getting worse and worse with every passing year. By 2013, South Korea's fertility rate had sunk low enough to become the lowest in the entire world, with the average South Korean woman only having 1.2 children during her lifetime. And then, defying just about everyone's expectations, it just continued sinking even lower than that. By 2019, South Korea became the first country in recorded history to reach a fertility rate of less than 1 child per woman, when it sunk to only 0.9. And then, it still just kept on decreasing year over year, setting new all-time civilizational low records until today in 2024, where it has sunk all the way to only 0.68 children per woman nationwide. The lowest ever recorded in a large human society throughout history, outside of major wars, plagues, or famines. This means that, essentially, for every 100 young child-producing age South Korean residents alive today, they will only produce roughly 34 children between them during their lifetimes. And if the fertility rate remains steady where it's at today, those 34 children will then have fewer than 12 children, and then those 12 children will only have 4 children. Meaning that the generation of young South Koreans 3 generations from now will only be 4% of the size of the current generation of young South Koreans today. Which, of course, represents an utter collapse in South Korea's population that will take place across the rest of the 21st century, as fewer and fewer children are born to replace the elderly who die from natural causes. The sheer speed at which South Korea's fertility rate has declined is also something that's completely unprecedented in human history. For the sake of comparison, the fertility rate in the United States back in 1800 stood at about 6 children per woman on average, and it took America roughly 170 years from then for its fertility rate to steadily decline to beneath the 2.1 replacement level in the 1970s. On the other hand, South Korea's fertility rate also stood at about 6 children per woman in 1960. But then, it only took the next 60 years for the country's fertility rate to absolutely plummet from 6 down to 0.8 children per woman by 2020. And in that same 60-year time frame between 1960 and 2020, America's fertility rate declined much more gradually from 3 children per woman to 1.7. As a result, South Korea's population almost certainly peaked at an all-time historic high in 2020 at 51.84 million people, and the next year in 2021 recorded South Korea's first net population decline since the Korean War of the early 1950s. 57,118 people in the country were lost overall in 2021, and then another 123,800 more were lost in 2022. And more people will be lost every single year to come in the country for decades longer. By the early 2070s, and only about 46 years from this video's release date, this accelerating trend is expected to result in South Korea's total population diminishing in size to only around 36 million people left over, a net loss of about 16 million people, or about 30% of the country's peak population in 2020. A scale of population decline that is unprecedented in human history outside of the plague that ravaged 14th century Europe. And then, it's going to just continue getting even worse from there. By the end of the century in 2100, South Korea's population will have likely lost roughly half of its peak 2020 population, and decline down to only about 25.5 million people left over, essentially reverting all the way back to the population that it used to have back in the early 1960s in the process. And all of this, of course, is assuming that the country's current birth rate of 0.68 children per woman stops decreasing any further and holds steady where it's currently at. But the thing about South Korea's unprecedentedly low fertility rate is that it's completely uncharted territory, with no prior precedent to truly understanding where it's actually going. None of this has ever happened before in human history to a society during peacetime absent of plagues and famines. And so, nobody's really sure where exactly the bottom of the country's fertility rate could eventually end up settling at. Demographers have been routinely shocked as the South Korean fertility rate has continued declining, lower than 1 child per woman since 2019 every single year to the present value of 0.68. And it's already even lower than that in many parts of the country. In the capital and largest city of the country, Seoul, where about 20% of the South Korean population lives, the fertility rate has already sunk to just 0.55 children per woman as of 2024, the lowest value currently in the country. That means that an average 100 child-producing age residents in Seoul today will only produce about 27 children to replace them during their lifetimes. But what's even more alarming than South Korea's rapid population decline that'll take place throughout the rest of the 21st century is going to be the composition of the South Korean population remaining behind by the 2070s and beyond. Since the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, modern capitalist societies have essentially been underpinned by the idea that a much larger, productive, working-age population of people aged 15 to 64 will contribute to the economy and support their much smaller dependent cohorts of retirement-age seniors aged 65 and up, and children aged 0 to 14. Children and the elderly don't really contribute anything to the economy and are net economic drains because they pull resources from the economy without contributing anything back to it. But that's always been fine so long as the productive working-age population of people in between them is many times larger in population. For all of human history since the Industrial Revolution, this has remained true for every society around the world, including in South Korea. Today in 2024, South Korea's working-age population of people is about 36.7 million people, while the country's retirement-age population is about 9 million people, meaning that for every 1 South Korean of retirement age today pulling resources out of the economy without contributing, there are about 4 South Koreans of working age that are still working and contributing to the economy to support them, which is a pretty good ratio and is about the same as the United States currently has. But as more and more South Koreans grow older with fewer children being born to replace them, this ratio will continue growing more and more lopsided as the median age in South Korea continues growing older. For decades throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when South Korea ranked among the poorest and the least developed countries in the world back when it was even worse off than North Korea, South Korea retained one of the youngest populations in the world. The median age of South Koreans didn't surpass 18 years old until 1972, when the median age in the United States at the same time was already 28 years. But since that time, the median age of South Koreans has risen dramatically faster than it has in the United States. Their median ages reached a point of parity in 2011, when their average citizens were each about 37 years old, and since then, the median age in the US has only increased by a single year to 38 years old in 2024, while in South Korea, the median age has soared by 8 additional years to 45 years old today, which is already the 11th highest out of large countries in the world, and it will of course get much worse with time. By the 2060s, the median age in South Korea will soar to more than 61 years old, which is also completely unprecedented in human history. Never before, ever, has there been a large human society where the majority of residents are older than the age of 60. To put this into perspective, the oldest major country in the world today is Japan with a median age of 49.5 years old. Even Monaco, a tiny microstate that's basically just full of old rich people, has a median age of 56.2 today, which is still more youthful than South Korea is projected to be in only a little more than 36 years from today. As a result of the increasing age in the country due to the decreased fertility rate, South Korea's population of seniors aged 65 and older is currently projected to reach 37% of the country's total population by 2045, which will then surpass Japan's percentage of elderly people by that point at 36.7% of their population, which means that South Korea will likely overtake Japan as the world's oldest society by then. By the early 2070s, nearly half of South Korea's remaining population will be of retirement age 65 and older, about 17.3 million senior citizens out of a country of only 36.7 million total people remaining. At the same time, South Korea's working-age population of people aged 15 to 64 by this point is projected to only be at around 16.6 million people, or only about 45% of the total population, compared to the larger 47% of the total population that'll be in retirement age. This is also something that has never before happened in human history, where the dependent, unproductive elderly population in a society will be even larger than the entire working-age productive part of society combined. This will, almost inevitably, do one of either two things by this point. It'll either place a massive, unprecedentedly huge financial and workload burden on the younger, working-age population of the country to support the huge numbers of retirees, since there will be more than one person in retirement for every one worker in the country, which will also put downward pressure on the nation's fertility rate even further, as young working-age people decide on having even fewer children just to ensure their own survival in a kind of demographic doom loop that'll keep on getting worse and worse as time passes on. Or, a very large amount of retirees in the country will have to either continue working well beyond the age of 65 and basically never retire, or be placed into hopeless, destitute poverty without any of the support they need to exist, assuming that nothing changes and all else remains equal as it is today. However, because the retirement age population will consistently become a larger and larger share of the overall population in South Korea until they eventually become the majority group in the country, and because South Korea is a democracy, the voting power of the elderly in the country will become superior to that of the younger working age population, which means that the elderly will simply vote in favor of their own interests and concerns and overpower the youth of the country in the process. Which means that South Korea is likely going to end up becoming one of the world's first true gerontocracies as a result. A society ruled by old people for the benefit of old people. This means that, more than likely, the elderly of South Korea will keep voting for politicians and policies that keep their own retirements as stable and secure as possible, which will necessarily come at the expense of the younger generations in the country in the form of higher taxes and longer working hours that'll put downward pressure on the nation's fertility rate even further. And so the demographic doom loop in South Korea will just keep on going ad nauseum. Which means that the current projections of South Korea losing about a third of its current population by the 2070s and half of its current population by 2100 could indeed be rather optimistic forecasts, if anything, despite how doomsday-esque they sound already. And this will all have incredibly profound consequences for South Korean society in the future. The older and older that South Korean society becomes, the less innovative and entrepreneurial and the more risk-averse the country will likely become, which reduces the chances of South Korea being able to find its way out of this mess through technological advancements on their own. The rapidly shrinking size of the country's working-age population will decrease the nation's productivity at the same time that the ballooning retirement population will introduce enormous financial burdens on the country, which will likely result in South Korea's GDP contracting while its debt levels explode and its inflation rates grow out of control. And exacerbating all of these issues will be the simple fact that South Korea's current infrastructure for nearly 52 million people will inevitably fall into a state of disrepair and neglect as the total population shrinks in half and the number of workers available to maintain all of it simply decreases along with them. All of this means that it is a demographic certainty that South Korea will steadily grow less and less economically competitive throughout the rest of the 21st century. And, as a result, South Korea's greatest historic ally and protector, the United States, may end up growing less and less incentivized and interested in continuing to spend tons of money defending South Korea from their biggest security risk, North Korea. The two sides of the Korean peninsula currently have lopsided populations, with the South having roughly twice the number of overall people and twice the number of working-age people as the North has. But, due to North Korea's dramatically higher levels of militarization that conscripts all North Korean men for 10-year terms in the armed forces, and selectively conscripts some of the country's women for 5-year terms, Pyongyang controls the larger standing army of 1.3 million personnel, compared to the South's smaller standing army of only 500,000 personnel that only conscripts men for fewer than 2-year terms and doesn't conscript women at all. As of 2024, North Korea's fertility rate is also beneath the replacement level and stands at an average of about 1.8 children per woman. But that's still more than double the number of children that South Korean women are having, which means that North Korea's population will be shrinking and aging as well, but at a much, much slower rate than in South Korea. By 2070, assuming that these fertility rates remain more or less constant, North Korea's total population will only decline to about 24 million people, while South Korea's will crash down to only 36 million, and their working-age populations will nearly approach the point of equivalency, with 14.3 million working-age people in North Korea and only 16.6 million working-age people in South Korea. If the North maintains its policies of hyper-militarization and the South fails to adapt, and the ratios of personnel in their standing armies out of their working-age populations remains the same as today, then the North will go from having a standing army of 1.3 million personnel to 1 million, while the South will go from having a standing army of 500,000 to just 225,000. Which means the North Korea will go from having a 2.6 times advantage in manpower in their armed forces today to having a 4.4 times advantage in manpower by simply doing nothing and waiting out the next 45 years. Will the US continue to commit itself to South Korea's defense decades in the future with these kinds of lopsided manpower variables, and with South Korea's diminished ability to pay for its own defense? Only time will tell. But South Korea only has very limited options available to it at this point of escaping from this demographic catastrophe. They can try to increase their fertility rate by orders of magnitude higher than it currently is. But it's gotten to such a terminal point by now that even if the South Koreans managed to double the amount of children they're having today, they would still only have one of the bottom 10 lowest fertility rates in the world. That's not to say that the South Korean government hasn't tried encouraging their people to have more children, though, because they definitely have. Just since 2006, the South Korean government has blown around $270 billion, or about 1% of its total GDP per year, on various incentives trying to encourage its people to have more babies, including tax breaks and cash grants for new parents, offering 90 days of paid maternity leave, and even trying out state-sponsored dating programs. Despite all of these efforts and how much money they've spent on them, though, the fertility rate has still decreased by about 25% since they began, meaning they've all had virtually zero impact, and South Korea has just flushed hundreds of billions of dollars down the toilet even trying. South Korea could also do what many European countries and America have done by opening themselves up to immigration and pulling in younger working-age people from abroad to replace the workers they're losing out to age. But South Korea has virtually zero history of immigration at all and is an extremely homogenous society. About 96% of the country's population are ethnic Koreans, and as of 2022, South Korea only had about 1.6 million total foreign-born residents, or only about 3% of their total population. By comparison, roughly 14% of America's population were born outside of the country today. South Korea currently has no possible path for any immigrants to the country to become either citizens or permanent residents unless they marry a native-born South Korean first. And in order for immigration to actually fully offset the cratering South Korean fertility rate, the country would almost certainly have to introduce roughly 10 times as many foreign workers to the country as they have currently. That will be millions of foreigners introduced to South Korea in a rapid amount of time, which is a shock that could simply prove too much for many South Koreans to approve of or want. The country can also try raising its retirement age, but this is something that's generally pretty unpopular among the people who want to retire sooner rather than later in life. South Korea already raised its retirement age from 58 to 60 in 2017, and there are already several labor unions in the country who want to raise the retirement age even further up to 64 or 65 to match up more with the retirement age in the United States. So, how did South Korea even find itself in the world's biggest demographic nightmare? Well, it's a pretty complex, multifaceted problem, but here are some of the most likely reasons why. For starters, South Korea began the process of industrialization much later than many other countries in Europe and North America did. The first half of the 20th century was a period of incredible struggle and hardship in Korea. The Japanese Empire ruthlessly colonized the peninsula for 35 years between 1910 and 1945, and dragged the Koreans into the Second World War in the process. And then, shortly afterwards, between 1950 and 1953, the peninsula was consumed by the devastating effects of the Korean War that killed millions more. After the Korean War ended in 1953, South Korea began its process of industrialization and improving living standards, and as a result, South Korea, like many other post-World War II societies, went through their own baby boom period in the later 1950s and early 60s that saw a huge increase in their population in the lower end of their population pyramid. Within only 15 years between the end of the Korean War in 1953 and 1968, the South Korean population exploded from fewer than 21 million people to well over 31 million, a nearly 50% population increase within only a single generation. In 1960, the average South Korean woman was having 6 children throughout her lifetime, And the country was still among the poorest in the entire world, with a per capita income of just about $82 per person per year, which was significantly poorer than North Korea was at the time, and was about on a par with most countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And so the South Korean government of the early 1960s became worried about the specter of overpopulation within their deeply impoverished, small, and mountainous country with little available open land and few natural resources. The government then decided to respond by rolling out a massive population control program in the early 1960s, designed to encourage South Korean women to begin having fewer children. Contraception methods were rolled out en masse, and the government set out a target of getting 45% of married couples in the country to begin using contraception, which before 1960 in pre-industrial South Korea was basically non-existent. This quickly led to a downward trend in the country's fertility rate that began in the 1960s. Then, the massive numbers of children born in the South Korean baby boom generation from about 1955 to 1974 and the lowering fertility rate all eventually resulted in South Korea's demographic dividend from about the early 1970s through the 1990s, the era where South Korea had the largest ratio of productive working-age people to elderly and children in the country's entire history, which supercharged the South Korean economy and gave it year after year of massive economic growth. As South Korea then rapidly industrialized and developed, living standards, incomes, and life expectancies all rapidly improved as well, and more rural South Koreans began abandoning the countryside for the new economic opportunities that were arising in the cities. In 1960, South Korea was overwhelmingly rural, with only about 28% of its population living in cities. But within only 40 years from then, South Korea rapidly developed from one of the world's most rural countries into one of its most urbanized ones, with about 80% of its population living in cities by 2000. But South Korea is a very mountainous place, and there isn't very much room to build very many big cities in. The country's population density is heavily concentrated within the small amounts of flatter land and valleys in between all of the gigantic mountains like Seoul and Busan. But with such limited available space for city building, cities became very densely populated and packed in together. And the same thing happened in South Korea as happened in every other country that industrialized and developed before it. People found out that in cities, having fewer children is often more economically advantageous than out on a farm in the countryside. And so, as more and more people moved into the cities, fewer and fewer of them began having larger families. And other things started happening too. For one, South Korean women began getting highly educated and started entering the country's workforce en masse, which resulted in a huge increase in female labor participation in the country. And South Korean women, just like South Korean men, are also generally expected to work long, grueling hours in the country's notoriously hard-working culture. As of 2022, according to data from the OECD, South Koreans work an average of 1,901 hours of labor per year, which makes South Koreans the hardest working people of any country that the IMF regards as a developed country. For context, Americans work an average of 1,811 hours per year, while Germans only work an average of 1,341 hours per year, which means that South Koreans on average work about 42% more hours at their jobs than their counterparts in Germany do. The standard South Korean working hours are from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. rather than the traditional 9 to 5 that's more common in America. And it's also commonly expected that South Korean employees will join their bosses and coworkers for drinks even after their shifts are theoretically over. Working so many hours in the country leaves little time left over for other pursuits like raising a family. And even though South Korea theoretically grants nationally guaranteed paid maternity leave, the country's grueling work ethic and fierce workplace competition means that most women fear that if they actually take their maternity leave, they won't be able to return back to their same jobs again afterward. They fear that their long absences will cause a lack of productivity at the workplace, which could result in them being passed up for promotions, or result in a difficult to measure but observable degree of stigma from their fellow hard-working coworkers who never took any time off. And even if mothers do make it back to their original jobs after taking maternity leave, they often find it hard to maintain their original wages, which all feeds into the fact that South Korean women suffer from the worst pay gap in the developed world. According to the Women in Work Index that is published annually by the accounting firm PwC, South Korean women earn on average 31.2% less than their male counterparts do, which is nearly double the gender pay gap that's present in the United States, and it's more than triple the gender pay gap that's present in Australia. South Korean women also have the lowest percentages of executive and managerial positions within the developed world as well, holding only 5% of the country's executive posts and only 21% of the country's managerial positions. Social expectations and pressures in South Korea evolved much more slowly than the economy itself did, and mothers in the country are generally expected to maintain an effectively impossible balance between managing most of the childcare themselves while also fully continuing their own hard-working careers at the same time. While their husbands are also expected to continue working long, tiring hours away from their home at the same time and are unavailable to offer very much help as a result. This, in essence, forces most women in South Korea to have to choose between having a career and becoming a mother, which leads to many women in the country choosing to prioritize their careers because of the insane cost of living in the country. South Korea has, by far, the worst housing affordability problem anywhere in the developed world today. In real estate, there is something known as the price-to-income ratio, which essentially just measures how many years it'll take the average household income in the country to afford the average-priced house. In the United States, which has its own well-publicized housing affordability issues, it currently takes roughly 4 years of the average household income to afford the average house. In Canada, it takes 9.6 years, and in France, it takes 10.8 years, each with dramatically worse housing affordability issues than in the United States. But in South Korea, it takes a whopping 20.3 years of the average household income just to afford the average-priced house right now, which makes housing practically unaffordable for the vast majority of the country. And it also makes South Korean housing practically impossible to afford for anyone on just a single income. 2 incomes are generally required to pay rents or mortgages in the country. And so, if a new couple have a child and one of the parents decides to stay at home to take care of them, they will almost certainly struggle to make their ends meet. And then, even if they do have children, the situation isn't really helped by the fact that South Korea is also literally the most expensive country in the entire world to raise a child in as well. A study conducted by a Beijing-based think tank called the Yuhua Population Research Institute concluded last year in 2023 that the cost to raise a child from birth to age 18 in South Korea cost a whopping 7.8 times the nation's GDP per capita, which is by far the highest anywhere in the world. For context, this study shows that the cost to raise a child in South Korea is more than twice as expensive as it is in Germany. It's more than 3 times as expensive as raising a child in France, and it's nearly 4 times as expensive as raising a child in Australia. And a very big reason why raising children in South Korea specifically is more expensive than literally anywhere else is because of the nature of how freakishly competitive South Korean society has become. You see, in order to kickstart economic development and growth in the resource-poor country back in the early 1960s, South Korea's then dictatorial government adopted a strategy of establishing a few massive megacorporations in the country, each owned by a single family dynasty that became known as chaebols. The chaebols were given hugely preferential tax treatment, generous loans, and other privileges in the country that enabled them to essentially become legally endorsed monopolies in South Korea that rapidly crushed all domestic competition. But by concentrating so much power into the hands of just a few of the chaebols in the country like Samsung, LG, Hyundai, and Kia, the chaebols grew big enough to enable them to properly compete on the global market with rival American, Japanese, and European companies. By pouring the country's resources into education, South Korea essentially set up a pipeline from birth that funnels children through school and into a job at one of the chaebols after graduation, where they'll produce high-end finished goods like electronics, semiconductors, cameras, cars, and even cutting-edge military equipment like fighter jets, self-propelled artillery, tanks, and even submarines. The chaebols drove South Korea's exports of finished goods to the world market into the stratosphere, to the point where little South Korea evolved from a rural backwater in the 1960s when exports accounted for only 4% of the national GDP, into the 9th largest exporting power in the world by 2022, where exports now represent more than 40% of the national GDP, and with more exports shipped out to the world than countries like India and Italy are even able to manage. And by design, the small number of chaebol megacorporations in South Korea came to steadily dominate the entire country's economy, so that they can compete with the rest of the outside world. By 2021, the top 10 largest chaebol corporations in the country accounted for nearly 60% of the country's entire GDP, with Samsung alone, the biggest chaebol, accounting for more than a fifth of South Korea's entire economy all on its own. The top 5 biggest chaebol corporations today, Samsung, SK Hynix, LG, Hyundai, and Kia together, represent roughly half of the entire South Korean stock market. A level of concentrated dominance over the country's economy and stock market that is unmatched by any other developed country in the world. By comparison, it takes the top 38 largest American companies to reach about half of the US stock market's capitalization, meaning that economic power in South Korea is far, far more concentrated in far fewer hands than it is in the United States. But while the utter dominance of the chaebols helped South Korea become a major export-driven economy and helped to lift millions of Koreans out of poverty in the process, they also created a lopsided and stupidly unequal domestic economy within South Korea itself. The small number of chaebol megacorporations in the country control more than 3/4 of the country's total market capital, but they only employ 12% of South Korean workers today. Meanwhile, small and medium-sized businesses in the country control only 23% of the country's market capital, and yet they employ an overwhelming 88% of all South Korean workers. So, naturally, all of the country's highest-paying and most prestigious jobs are all at the chaebol megacorporations that only employ 12% of the country's workers. And there obviously aren't enough positions at the chaebols for everyone in the country to have one. This has therefore led to a systemic culture of fierce competition within modern South Korea among parents who want to give their children the best possible odds at getting a job with one of the chaebols in the future after they graduate from college so that they'll have as high of an income as possible later on in life. And it all starts at a very young age when South Korean children are as young as 4. From the age of 4 until they go to university, virtually all South Korean children will have private extracurricular tuition paid for by their parents, with a heavy emphasis on mathematics and English language. A study made in 2022 on this phenomenon in South Korea found that only 2% of parents in the country didn't pay for their children to have a private tuition, despite the fact that 94% of South Korean parents responded by saying that the heavy cost of private tuition for their children was a financial burden. The practice of sending one's children to private tuition in the country has become so ubiquitous that parents who don't send their children are often seen as irresponsible or setting up their children for failure. South Korean parents will spend up to $890 per month per child on these private tuition lessons, and that's in addition to all of the other costs associated with raising a child as well. And even if they can't afford to do it, most South Korean parents will still do it anyway because they know if they don't, their children won't stand a chance in the country's economic pipeline against all of the other children who are getting private tuition. In order to secure one of the country's few prestigious and high-paying jobs at one of the chaebols, a child's best odds will be to graduate from high school and go to one of the so-called sky universities in the country's capital, Seoul. Seoul National University, Korea University, and Yonsei University, the country's top 3 most prestigious universities and essentially the South Korean Ivy League. A study done in 2010 found that more than 46% of South Korean high government officials, more than half of the country's CEOs, and more than 60% of the country's practicing lawyers were all graduates of the 3 Sky Universities. Attending one of the Sky Universities and graduating is seen as a person's ticket to a high-status life in South Korea, but with an acceptance rate that averages only between 1% and 2% of all the applicants who apply per year, it's very difficult to get in, and only the top of children will actually succeed. And that's why every parent in the country feels such an enormous pressure to send their children to expensive private tuition programs to give them the best possible competitive edge. But for the 98 to 99% of South Korean children who will never get accepted to the Sky Universities, and for the 88% of South Korean workers who will never get a job outside of the country's chaebols, they will often feel as if they spend an entire lifetime intensely studying, competing, and working, all for what will eventually amount to just a mediocre life at the end of it all. And then, many of them just won't want to spend insane amounts of their own limited money to raise another child, just to go through the exact same agonizing process of being let down that they went through. And then, when they get to old age, they don't really have too much to look forward to either, since South Korea also has the second highest levels of elderly poverty rates in the entire OECD as well. 39% of South Koreans over the age of 65 live beneath the country's poverty line today, compared to only 23% of the elderly in the United States who do so, and only 14% of the elderly in Germany who do so. As a result of all of these numerous problems in the country related to housing and childcare affordability, men and women alike in the country have been consistently delaying the ages at which they are getting married and start having children. 4 decades ago, back in 1985, South Korean women were getting married at an average age of 24 years old. Then, within a couple of decades, by 2007, South Korean women were getting married 4 years later on average at the age of 28. And now, nearly 2 more decades after that in 2024, South Korean women are, on average, not getting married until they're 32 years old, which is among the highest ages in the world. South Korean men, meanwhile, aren't getting married on average until they're 34 years old now. And as a result, prospective couples in South Korea are having children far later in life than their historical predecessors did, because virtually no children in South Korea are born outside of wedlock today. It is still considered to be a big stigma in South Korea to have children outside of marriage. And as a result, South Korea has one of the lowest out-of-wedlock birth rates in the entire world as well, with only 2.5% of births in the country being outside of marriage as recently as 2020. By comparison, a much larger 40.5% of all births in the United States took place outside of marriage that same year. This means that since most South Koreans today aren't getting married until their early to mid-30s, and since virtually nobody has children outside of marriage in the country, practically nobody in the country is having any children before they turn 30 in South Korea. And if a couple divorces, they're even less likely to have children, and the divorce rate in the country has risen to also be among the world's highest as well. As of 2019, roughly 47% of all marriages in South Korea were ending in divorce, the 13th highest out of all the countries in the OECD, and slightly higher than the divorce rate in the United States. There is also just simply a big gap that's emerging in political viewpoints between South Korean men and women as well. The Economist released a poll in 2024 that found that the gap between young South Korean men aged 20 to 29 self-identifying as conservative and young South Korean women aged 20 to 29 self-identifying as conservative was 7.4 percentage points wide. The poll also concluded that 80% of young South Korean men in their 20s believe that men are being discriminated against in the country, while only 30% of young South Korean women in their 20s felt the same way. In the 2022 South Korean presidential election, the country elected Yoon Suk-yeol, who ran on an openly anti-feminist platform. A man who vowed to destroy the country's Ministry of Gender Equality and Family once he took office, who has blamed South Korea's declining fertility rate on feminism, and who has denied that gender-based discrimination exists in South Korea despite the country having the largest gender pay gap in the entire developed world. 59% of South Korean men in their 20s supported him, compared to 58% of South Korean women in their 20s who chose to support his political rival instead. This sharp divergence in world outlook that is emerging between young South Korean men and women is leading to many young men and women in the country alike feeling that they don't want to date their national counterparts, and that they would rather search for a partner somewhere abroad instead, which is also probably having an adverse effect on the nation's total fertility rate on top of all of the other countless problems too. Overall, the demographic catastrophe that is facing South Korea is a multifaceted problem that will take a lot of effort to fix and turn around. South Korea's entire economy and society will each need to be restructured in fundamental ways to escape from the abyss that is slowly creeping towards them. Whether it's radically changing the country's work culture, tackling the housing affordability and the education affordability issues, bridging the significant gap between men and women in the country, dramatically increasing automation, welcoming millions of new immigrants to the country, significantly raising the retirement age, or a combination of several of these ideas all at once and maybe a few more. Because if they don't do anything, it will be a tragedy of historic proportions that South Korea achieved some of the greatest and the most rapid economic progress in all of human history that lifted millions of people out of poverty, only to end up paying the price of leaving nobody behind to actually inherit any of it. Now, there's a lot of data that goes into producing these kinds of videos. Whether it's showing how rapidly South Korea's population will decline over time, showing how the age composition of South Korean society will evolve with time, how South Korean cities and people are limited by small amounts of space in between their mountains, or just how South Korea's fertility rate has evolved with time, the ability to visualize raw data like this is exactly what makes learning about these kinds of things so fascinating to me. And it's why the Exploring Data Visually course is one of my favorite courses that I've ever taken with this video's sponsor, Brilliant.org. Brilliant.org is a STEM learning platform that helps you learn by actually doing. They don't just give you a mountain of text and then expect you to remember everything you just read. They use interactive exercises to teach you the intuitive principles. Then build these principles upon each other so that you can genuinely understand complex subjects like data visualization and analysis, statistics, computer science, astrophysics, and tons of others. They really know how to teach for results, which is why Brilliant.org is perfect for the kind of person who wants to learn because they love learning, not because they're being forced to. And best of all, with their mobile app and smaller bite-sized course chunks, it's really possible to fit learning on Brilliant.org into any schedule, no matter how busy your day-to-day activities are. So, if you're the type of person who loves learning new things, you can try out everything Brilliant.org has to offer for free for a full 30 days by clicking the button here on your screen right now, or by visiting brilliant.org/reallifelore, or by clicking the link down below in the description. And best of all, you'll also get 20% off of an annual premium subscription. And as always, thank you so much for watching.